Before we dive into one of the most powerful untold stories of World War II, let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if anyone in your family lived through this era. This story needs to be heard. What you're about to witness is not just history. It's a testament to the raw power of humanity in its darkest hour, a moment so profound that it shattered everything the world thought it knew about war, honor, and forgiveness. In the ashes of Yokohama in the winter of 1945, something impossible happened. Something that military textbooks never taught, that propaganda never predicted, that hatred said could never exist. British soldiers, the very men Japan had been taught to fear as demons, sat down with Japanese women and children, the families of their former enemies, and did something that would make both sides weep. They shared their food. But this wasn't charity. This wasn't occupation protocol. This was something else entirely. This was the moment when two nations, drenched in the blood of war, discovered that the line between enemy and human was thinner than anyone had dared to imagine. The scene seemed impossible because the context made it so. Just months before, the Pacific War had reached its apocalyptic conclusion. Cities had been reduced to atomic shadows. Millions had perished. The propaganda machines of both empires had spent years dehumanizing the other side, painting each other as monsters incapable of mercy, undeserving of compassion. Japanese civilians had been instructed to fear the Allied occupation with every fiber of their being. Stories circulated of atrocities, of retribution, of a conquering force that would exact vengeance for every drop of blood spilled. Women hid their children. Families prepared for the worst. The occupation was coming, and with it, they believed, would come unspeakable horror. But war has a strange way of revealing truth, and the truth about to unfold in Yokohama would challenge everything both sides thought they knew about each other, about themselves, and about what it means to be human when everything else has been stripped away. Captain James Montgomery was not the kind of officer you'd find in propaganda posters. At 43, he was older than most of his peers, a man who had seen the Great War as a boy, watched his father return broken from the trenches, and carried that memory through every decision he made in uniform. He had volunteered for service in 1939, not out of patriotic fervor but out of a quiet, stubborn belief that someone had to stand between the world and darkness. His men described him as peculiar. He read poetry in the barracks. He learned basic phrases in every language of every country they passed through. Not for strategic advantage, but because he believed that speaking someone's language, even poorly, was an act of respect. His superiors tolerated his eccentricities because he was brilliant at logistics and because his units had lower casualty rates than anyone else's. They didn't know it was because Montgomery saw the enemy soldiers not as targets, but as men who also wanted to go home. This perspective, unusual to the point of suspicion in wartime, would soon make him the most important man in Yokohama. When Montgomery's battalion arrived in the ruins of Yokohama in November 1945, they found a city that barely existed anymore. The firebombing campaigns had turned entire neighborhoods into fields of ash and twisted metal. Survivors lived in makeshift shelters constructed from salvaged wood and rusted sheets of corrugated iron. There was no infrastructure, no food distribution, no medical care. The Japanese government had collapsed into chaos. Local authorities had fled or were paralyzed by the magnitude of disaster. The people who remained, mostly women, children, and the elderly, the men having been lost to the war, existed in a state of numb desperation. They scavenged for roots in the frozen ground. They boiled tree bark for something resembling sustenance. And they watched the British soldiers arrive with hollow eyes, waiting for the violence they'd been promised would come. Montgomery walked through these ruins during his first patrol and felt something crack open inside him. He saw mothers clutching skeletal children. He saw old men bowing respectfully to the soldiers, their dignity intact despite having nothing. He saw young women, probably his daughter's age, trying to make shelters weatherproof before winter truly set in. That night he violated his first order. He distributed half his unit's rations to the civilians they encountered. His actions didn't go unnoticed. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison Pierce was everything Montgomery was not. Pierce was young, ambitious, a career officer who saw the occupation as an opportunity to build his reputation and advance through the ranks. He was a man of protocols, of hierarchies, of clear lines. Between us and them. Pierce had fought in Burma, had seen the brutality of the Pacific Campaign firsthand, had lost friends to Japanese bullets and strategy. He carried that loss as anger, carefully controlled but always present, and he viewed the occupation through the lens of victory and defeat, conqueror and conquered. When reports reached him that Montgomery was fraternizing with civilians and distributing military supplies without authorization, Pierce saw both a breach of discipline and an insult to everyone who had died fighting Japan. He was not alone in this view. Several officers in the command structure shared his perspective. Major Thompson, Captain Davies, even some of Montgomery's own men questioned what they saw as misplaced compassion. The tension was immediate and public. Within a week of arrival, the British command in Yokohama was divided into two camps, and the Japanese civilians caught between them had no idea that their fate was being debated in officers' tents. Every night. The confrontation erupted during a command briefing in late November. The setting was a requisition building that had somehow survived the bombing, its walls still standing but windows shattered, cold wind cutting through the space. 20 officers gathered around a battered table covered with maps and supply manifests. Montgomery had just finished presenting a proposal that he'd worked on for 3 sleepless nights. He wanted to establish communal feeding stations throughout Yokohama using British military supplies supplemented by requisitioned local resources, open to all civilians regardless of their war record or affiliation. He argued it was both a moral imperative and a strategic necessity. Starving people became desperate people, and desperate people destabilized occupation efforts. More than that, he argued, showing mercy now would build goodwill that could last generations, would demonstrate that British values of decency and civilization weren't just propaganda but actual principles worth fighting for. He spoke carefully, methodically, laying out logistics and timelines, addressing practical concerns before they could be raised. The room listened in tense silence. Then Pierce stood up. "This is absurd." Pierce's voice cut through the room like a blade, sharp and cold and absolute. "Captain Montgomery, with all due respect, you're proposing we feed the enemy. These people supported a regime that committed atrocities across Asia. These women, you're so concerned about made munitions that killed our brothers. These children were being trained to fight us with bamboo spears. And you want to give them our food. Food that our soldiers need? Food that our taxpayers provided, and ask nothing in return? This isn't compassion, Captain. This is betrayal." The room shifted uncomfortably. Several officers nodded. Thompson leaned back with his arms crossed, a small, satisfied smile on his face. Davies stared at the table, unwilling to meet Montgomery's eyes. The division was clear, and Pierce had just drawn the line in the sharpest possible terms. Montgomery remained seated, his hands folded on the table, his expression unchanged. He let the silence stretch out. Let Pierce's words hang in the cold air. Let the discomfort build. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, so quiet that everyone had to lean in to hear him. And that shift in posture, that involuntary movement toward him, was the first small victory. "Lieutenant, Colonel Pierce, I understand your anger. I respect it. You've lost friends, and those losses are not abstract numbers on a report. They're men you knew, men you cared about, men whose absence you feel every day. I won't diminish that." Montgomery paused, and something in his tone made even Pierce sit back down. "But I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, not as an officer but as a man. When this war started, what were we told we were fighting for? Were we told we were fighting to become like them, to mirror their cruelty, to prove we could be just as ruthless? Or were we told we were fighting because we believed in something better? Because we believed that civilization, decency, mercy, these things mattered, even when they were difficult, especially when they were difficult?" The room was silent now, a different kind of silence. Those women and children out there, they didn't start this war. They didn't choose it. They were lied to, propagandized, told that we were monsters coming to destroy them. And now we're here, and we have a choice. We can prove their propaganda right. We can let them starve, let them suffer, tell ourselves they deserve it because of what their government did. Or we can prove that everything we said we stood for actually meant something. We can show them that the men they were taught to fear are actually men of honor, men of compassion, men who understand that the war is over, and that what comes next is peace. And peace begins with mercy. Pierce's face was red now, a vein pulsing at his temple. But Montgomery wasn't finished. "You say these women made munitions. Do you know why? Do you think they had a choice? Do you think they woke up one morning and decided they wanted to contribute to the war effort? Or do you think they were conscripted, threatened, told their families would suffer if they refused? You say these children were being trained to fight. They're children, Colonel. They believed what they were told because that's what children do. And now the people who lied to them are gone, and they're alone, and they're starving, and we have the power to help them or to let them die. And you're telling me that letting them die is the honorable choice? That's not honor, Colonel. That's vengeance. And vengeance isn't what we fought for. The silence now was absolute. Montgomery's words had shifted something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Even Thompson had uncrossed his arms. Davies was looking at Montgomery with something like wonder. But Pierce wasn't done. And what came next would be the true test. You think you're better than us, don't you, Montgomery? Pierce's voice was shaking now, anger giving way to something more personal, more wounded. You think because you hand out food and learn their language that you're somehow more civilized, more enlightened. You're not a soldier. You're a bleeding heart who doesn't understand what we're dealing with here. These people are defeated, but they're not sorry. They'd kill us tomorrow if they had the chance. And you want to sit down and have tea with them? Pretend we're all friends now? Wake up, Captain. This is occupation, not a charity mission. We're here to maintain order and prepare for repatriation, not to run soup kitchens for people who celebrated when Pearl Harbor burned. The personal attack hung in the air, and for the first time, Montgomery's composure cracked just slightly. His jaw tightened. His eyes, which had been calm, now showed a flash of something harder. When he stood up, the movement was slow, deliberate, and every eye in the room tracked him as he walked around the table to stand directly across from Pierce. You want to know what I think, Colonel? I think you're afraid. Montgomery's voice was still quiet, but now it carried an edge, a weight that made the words land like physical blows. I think you're afraid that if you see these people as human, if you acknowledge their suffering, if you extend them mercy, it will somehow diminish what you endured, what you lost. I think you're afraid that compassion makes you weak, that if you let go of your anger for even a moment, you'll fall apart. And I understand that fear, Colonel, because I've felt it too. But let me tell you what I learned. What I learned watching my father come home from the Somme. What I learned watching men die in France. What I've learned in every war I've seen. Hatred is easy. Anger is easy. Dehumanizing the enemy is the easiest thing in the world because it protects you from having to feel the weight of what war actually does. But easy doesn't mean right. And if we choose easy now, if we choose hatred and vengeance because it feels safer than mercy, then every man who died believing we were the good side died for nothing. Because we won't be the good side anymore. We'll just be another occupying force in a long history of occupying forces. And this cycle will never end. The room was paralyzed. No one moved. No one breathed. Pierce's face had gone from red to white. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a long moment it seemed like he might lunge at Montgomery, might throw a punch, might let his rage explode into violence. But then something happened that no one expected. His eyes filled with tears. His shoulders sagged, and when he spoke again, his voice was broken, barely more than a whisper. They killed Thompson. Did you know that? Lieutenant Thompson, my best friend. We went through Sandhurst together. The Japanese killed him in Burma, tortured him. We found his body and I can't forget what they did to him. I can't forgive it. How am I supposed to just forget that and feed them like nothing happened? And there it was. The wound beneath the anger. The grief that had been driving every harsh word. Every rigid stance. Montgomery's expression softened immediately. He moved closer to Pierce, close enough that their conversation became private, even though everyone could still hear. You're not supposed to forget, Richard. You're never supposed to forget. And forgiveness. That's not something I can demand of you. That's between you and whatever peace you can find. But I'm not asking you to forgive. I'm asking you to be better than what was done to Thompson. I'm asking you to make sure that his death meant something. That it led to a world where fewer mothers lose their sons, where fewer friends bury each other. Those women and children out there, they've lost. People too. They're grieving too. And grief, that's something we actually share with them. Maybe that's where peace starts, not in forgetting or forgiving, but in recognizing that we've all lost something and that we have the power to make sure future generations lose less. The shift in the room was palpable. Pierce didn't respond immediately, but his posture had changed, his defensiveness crumbling. Other officers who had been nodding along with him were now looking uncertain, questioning their own positions. Montgomery had done something remarkable. He'd turned the confrontation from a battle into a conversation, from an argument into an invitation to shared humanity. But this was just the first battle in what would become a prolonged campaign, because changing policy was one thing, changing hearts was another. And the real test would come when they actually implemented the feeding program and faced the reality of sitting down with the enemy they'd been taught to hate. Du Pais. Feeding stations opened a week later, despite continued resistance from parts of the command structure. Montgomery had won official approval through a combination of his proposal's practical arguments and the quiet support of the commanding general, who had heard about the confrontation and decided that Montgomery's approach aligned with broader occupation policies of rebuilding rather than punishing. But approval from above didn't mean cooperation from below. Many soldiers were uncomfortable with the initiative, confused about why they were helping people they'd been trying to kill just months ago. The tension was visible when the first stations opened in early December, in 3 locations across Yokohama, each staffed by a rotation of British soldiers who served rice, bread, and soup to lines of Japanese civilians who approached with terror and disbelief in equal measure. Montgomery insisted on one non-negotiable rule. The British soldiers didn't just hand out food, they sat down and ate with the civilians. This detail shocked everyone. It violated every instinct of occupier and occupied, every protocol of distance and hierarchy. But Montgomery knew that the act of eating together, of sharing a meal, was one of the most ancient and powerful rituals of peace humanity had ever developed. It said, "Without words, we trust you enough to be vulnerable with you." It said, "You are worth my time, my attention, my presence." It said, "We are not so different." The first day was agony. The civilians who came, mostly women and children, approached the feeding stations as if walking to their own executions. They had heard about the food distribution through word of mouth, whispers that spread through the ruins like tentative hope. But hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed so many times, and so they came prepared for cruelty, for mockery, for some new form of humiliation. Instead, they found Montgomery himself at the first station, sitting on an overturned crate, bowl of rice in his hands, gesturing for an elderly woman to sit beside him. The woman froze. She looked at Montgomery, then at the other soldiers, then back at Montgomery. She said something in Japanese, her voice shaking, bowing repeatedly. Montgomery didn't understand the words, but he understood the fear. He stood slowly, keeping his movements gentle, and bowed back, matching her depth, showing respect. Then he gestured again to the crate beside him, and this time, when he smiled, it was warm and genuine and carried no threat. The woman sat. Montgomery handed her a bowl piled higher than his own. And then he did something that no one had expected him to do, something that hadn't been in any of his reports or proposals. He began to speak to her in halting, broken Japanese, phrases he'd been practicing with a dictionary every night for weeks. Tabete kudasai, please eat. Anata wa anzen desu, you are safe. His pronunciation was terrible, mangled by his British accent and lack of practice. But the attempt itself was more eloquent than perfect grammar ever could have been. The woman stared at him, and then tears began to stream down her weathered face. She brought the bowl to her lips with shaking hands and ate. And Montgomery ate beside her. And the soldiers watched this strange, impossible scene. And something shifted. Other civilians began to sit. Other soldiers, hesitantly at first, joined them. There were no translators for most of these interactions, just gestures, nods, the universal language of breaking bread together. An old man bowed so deeply to the young private who handed him soup that the private, embarrassed and moved, bowed back. A mother with 2 small children was given extra portions, and when she tried to refuse, to take less for herself so her children could have more, a British sergeant gently pushed the bowl back to her and brought out more food for the children, and the mother wept into her hands while her children ate. By the end of that first day, over 200 civilians had been fed, and more than that, they had been seen. They had been treated not as enemies or defeated subjects, but as people deserving of dignity and care. But not everyone saw it as a triumph. That evening, as Montgomery was filing his report, a group of 5 soldiers approached him, led by Corporal Stevens, a young man who had fought through some of the bloodiest campaigns in the Pacific. Stevens was nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, but his jaw was set with determination. "Captain, sir, can we speak frankly?" Montgomery looked up from his paperwork, immediately noting the tension in the group. "Of course, Corporal. What's on your mind?" Stevens glanced at his companions, then took a breath. "Sir, with respect, what we did today, it doesn't sit right with some of us. These people, their army, they did terrible things. My mate, Private Wilson, he was captured in Singapore. Spent 3 years in a Japanese POW camp. He barely survived. And now we're sitting down and having meals with them like we're old friends? It feels wrong, sir. It feels like we're betraying the men who suffered, the men who died." The other soldiers nodded, and Montgomery could see the genuine conflict in their faces. These weren't men like Pierce, driven by personal vendetta. These were men trying to reconcile competing instincts, trying to be good soldiers and good men and not sure how to be both at once. Montgomery set down his pen and gave them his complete attention. Another one of his peculiarities, the way he treated even the lowest-ranking private as someone whose thoughts mattered. Corporal Stevens, tell me something. When Private Wilson was in that camp, when he was suffering, what do you think kept him alive? What did he hold on to? Stevens frowned, not expecting a question. I suppose he held on to the hope of going home, sir. Held on to the idea that there was something better waiting, that it wouldn't be like that forever. Montgomery nodded. Hope for something better. And what is that something better, do you think? A world where we keep doing to them what they did to us? Where suffering just echoes back and forth forever? Or a world where someone, somewhere, has the courage to say, this cycle ends with me. I will be better than what was done to me and mine. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the ruins of Yokohama lit by small fires and the moon. I don't know Private Wilson, but I know men like him, because I've met dozens of them over the years, men who endured hell and came out the other side. And do you know what the best of them want? They don't want revenge. They want meaning. They want to believe their suffering wasn't pointless. And the only way it's not pointless is if something better comes from it. If the world actually changes. If the next generation doesn't have to go through what they went through. He turned back to face them. When you sat with those civilians, today when you shared your food with them, you weren't betraying Private Wilson. You were honoring him. You were building the world he survived for. You were proving that British soldiers can be strong enough to fight and wise enough to make peace. That's harder than anything you did in combat, lads. Combat is instinct, adrenaline, training taking over. But this, sitting with the enemy and treating them with dignity, that takes a different kind of courage, the kind that changes history. The silence that followed was contemplative rather than confrontational. Stevens looked at his boots, thinking hard. One of the other soldiers, Private Harris, spoke up quietly. My dad fought in the Great War, sir. He came home angry, bitter. Spent my whole childhood hearing about how much he hated the Germans. He drank himself to death when I was 15. I don't want to be like that, sir. I don't want to carry that anger for the rest of my life. Montgomery's expression softened with compassion. Then don't, Private. Anger is a choice we make every day. So is mercy. And I promise you this, 30 years from now, when you're an old man telling your children about the war, you won't be proud of the enemies you hated. You'll be proud of the mercy you showed. That's what you'll want them to remember about you. The soldiers left that night still uncertain but less hostile, and that small shift was everything, because change never happens all at once. It happens in small surrenders, tiny transformations, one conversation at a time. Over the following weeks, the feeding stations became fixtures of daily life in Yokohama. The numbers grew exponentially. 3 stations became 6, then 12. More soldiers volunteered for the duty, initially out of obligation, but increasingly because something unexpected was happening. Bonds were forming. The British soldiers were learning the names of the regulars, the old man who always bowed, the mother with twin daughters, the teenage boy who had lost his whole family and came to the station not just for food, but for human contact. And the Japanese civilians, in turn, were discovering that the monsters they'd been warned about were just men, young men far from home, lonely and tired, and as confused about peace as the civilians themselves. Small gifts began to appear. A woman brought origami cranes she'd folded from salvaged paper and left them for the soldiers. A child drew a picture and shyly presented it to Private Harris, who kept it in his breast pocket for the rest of his life. An old man who had been a carpenter before the war helped repair a table at one of the stations, working alongside British engineers in companionable silence. But the most profound moment came on a bitter cold evening in mid-December, when a woman named Keiko Tanaka arrived at Montgomery Station. She was in her mid-30s, thin to the point of frailty, dressed in a threadbare kimono that had once been beautiful but was now patched and faded. She had a 5-year-old daughter with her, and both of them looked like they hadn't eaten properly in weeks. Montgomery saw them join the line and felt the familiar ache in his chest that he'd learned to carry, the pain of seeing suffering you could only partially alleviate. He served them himself, making sure the portions were generous, and gestured for them to sit at the communal table. Keiko sat, but she didn't eat immediately. Instead, she stared at the food as if it might disappear, and then she did something that stopped Montgomery cold. She began to cry. Not quietly, not with the restrained dignity he'd seen in so many others, but with great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Her daughter looked frightened, trying to comfort her mother, and the other civilians and soldiers nearby fell silent, unsure how to respond. Montgomery knelt beside Keiko. His own eyes stinging with tears he refused to let fall. He didn't speak, didn't try to comfort her, with words she wouldn't understand. He simply stayed there, present with her pain, letting her know through his presence that it was safe to break, that her grief was witnessed and honored. When she finally caught her breath, she looked at him and spoke in rapid Japanese, words tumbling over each other, desperate to be understood. Montgomery couldn't comprehend the language, but he didn't need to. He could hear the apology in her tone, the gratitude, the disbelief, the weight of months or years, of fear finally releasing. He took her hand gently, something he'd never done with a civilian before, a breach of propriety he chose deliberately, and he said the only thing he could think to say. Daijubu. Anata wa kazoku desu. It's okay. You are family.